There are many on the non-socialist left who agree with the basic ethical and political ideas that come out of the socialist tradition. A good deal of those who consider themselves left of centre support the idea of greater or much greater egalitarianism in the distribution of social wealth. Many agree with the socialist thinkers, most notably Marx, who have claimed that wealth is socially produced and privately appropriated through unjust private property relations founded on a superfluous system of social classes and state violence. Most agree with socialism that a fairer society, based on the common ownership of the means of production and rational, democratic control over society's productive capacities, would lead to a more humane social order, based on the principles of solidarity, community, fraternity, and equality. But beyond those relatively isolated groups who campaign for a genuinely socialist society, there are few on the left who believe that socialism can provide the one thing that it needs to provide in order to become a politically and historically viable force once more, and that's material prosperity. I'm going to contend that there are three basic forces that need to be taken into consideration when deciding whether socialism can provide at least as much, or perhaps even more, material prosperity than capitalism. Two of them, I'll argue, militate in favour of the idea that socialism can perform this feat. The other militates in favour of capitalism, but I'll try to show here that the two outweigh the one, and that a democratic socialism for the 21st century should be able to provide at least as high a material standard of living as 21st century capitalism. The first force that needs to be considered is the impact of equality. When we talk about material prosperity, we need to make sure we know whose prosperity we're talking about. Sure, we produce a lot more wealth now per person than we did 30 or 40 years ago, but skyrocketing inequality has seen to it that a very small percentage indeed of that wealth has found its way into the pockets of the mass of people. The material prosperity of a country's average citizen will often be impacted just as much by how great a share of total wealth each person receives as it will be by the absolute level of productivity. For example, the UK at present produces around $2.1 trillion worth of value per year. This is the total productivity of the UK. The average income of a UK citizen is supposed to be in the region of £26,500, not a figure to be sniffed at. But this figure is the mean, which need not necessarily say anything about the standard of living of the majority of people. In fact, around 60% of people in the UK earn far less than this average, bringing in between £12,000 and £17,000 a year, around half of the so-called average. The £26,500 figure is actually nearer to what each person would earn if Britain was a socialist society. In a Britain in which wages were completely egalitarian, each person would receive the result of dividing total GDP by the number of workers, a sum which results in the staggering figure of £36,000 per year per person. The gulf between the standard of living of a person picked at random in capitalist Britain, around £14,000 a year, compared with that of a person picked at random from a socialist Britain with the same productive capacity, isn't too far off a 2.5-fold difference. Equality matters. Of course, only about half of people in Britain work, the rest being either children, retirees, the sick and disabled, or the unemployed. But even if we extend the principle of egalitarianism to every man, woman and child on these islands, we arrive with a figure in excess of £18,000 per year. This is an income, and thus a standard of living, significantly higher than that presently enjoyed by most people in Britain. And this is the case even when children, retirees and the unemployed are being looked after to exactly the same standard as people who work. So equality is the first force that needs to be taken into account, but with the second we find a capitalist spanner thrown in the works. It is taken to be an unconditional truth by the entire right and the majority of the left that a socialist society cannot possibly match or even approach the absolute level of productivity of a capitalist society with a comparable population and natural resource endowment. Even from within the Marxian theoretical tradition, this is an idea with some traction. Since labour creates all wealth, and since capitalism is defined as that socio-economic system which exploits labour to the highest possible degree given historical circumstances, it would seem to stand to reason that a capitalist society would be more productive than a socialist one, since the latter form of society is presumably defined by lower levels of exploitation. Now, let's remind ourselves of what exploitation is from the Marxian point of view. Workers produce a given quantity of goods and services for society by selling their labour power to capitalists and using the raw materials and machines that the capitalists uniquely own. They are then paid a wage representing some fraction of that total productivity. That is, they consume in wages some fraction of what they produce with their labour. The difference between what the workers produce and what they are paid is called the surplus. What makes this process exploitative, from Marx's point of view, is that the capitalists, and not the workers, appropriate, own, and control this surplus. Note that the Marxian definition of exploitation is not synonymous with the mere fact that workers do not consume the full product of their labour. There is no reason whatsoever why a socialist society would not also be one in which production was larger than consumption. In fact, it would have to be. But the key point here is that what is exploitative about the equation P greater than C, or production larger than consumption, is the question of who controls the difference, the surplus. It's probably fair to say that the minimal definition of a socialist society is that it is a society in which workers, and not an economic or political elite, control the surplus. So, while it is true to say that a socialist society is less exploitative than a capitalist one, since it is the workers who appropriate the surplus produced by their labours, it is not true to say that this will result in an automatic decrease in productivity. Increases in productivity, that is, growth, is produced when a portion of the surplus is reinvested into the productive process in such a way as to expand it, usually by researching and developing improvements in machinery, equipment, and processes, and through developments in the education of workers. Alternatively, a society could decide not to grow, and to simply repeat the same quantity of production over and over again, creating a so-called steady-state economy. Even then, however, some of what is produced will need to be kept aside from consumption in order to provide the raw materials and machines for the next round of production. There is, then, an absolute and a variable quantity of surplus which a society can elect to produce. The absolute level is the level required to repeat production at the same level. The variable level is anything above this, that is, the surplus required for X or Y or Z level of growth. Under capitalism, the variable level is the highest it can possibly be, since workers are exploited to the greatest extent that they will tolerate before defying the capitalists politically. A socialist society may decide to produce exactly the same quantity of surplus as a comparable capitalist society, and to reinvest it in such a way as to produce exactly the same level of growth. Alternatively, it may decide to use some of the surplus to fund additional wages, thus lowering the amount available for reinvestment. The use of the surplus, of course, is not the only economic lever at the disposal of a socialist society. Workers may elect, for instance, to work fewer days or shorter hours while maintaining the same level of wages, which would obviously decrease the surplus and thus the capacity for growth. Since a socialist society would be run by the workers and based on the principles of increasing freedom and leisure time in order for everyone to be able to develop their creative capacities to the fullest extent, we can say with some confidence that choices such as these would be made. Since capitalist economies have no choice but to grow as rapidly as possible, this could indeed result in a lower level of absolute productivity in comparison to comparable capitalist societies. Assuming this were to be the case, and it need not be, how would standards of living in our socialist society compare to a capitalist neighbour? At this point, we should square the two forces we've looked at so far off one another. Equality should always be factored in to the measurement of standards of living given particular absolute levels of productivity. When comparing an inegalitarian capitalist Britain with an egalitarian socialist Britain with the same absolute levels of productivity, we saw that in capitalist Britain, the working half of the population received an average of about £14,000 per year, and the non-working population received nothing in wages, being supported instead by the working population and to some degree by tax-funded social support programs. In socialist Britain, in contrast, we saw that each and every person received over £18,000 per year, whether they worked or not. Another way of doing this would be that every working person in Britain would receive £36,000 per year, provided that absolute productivity remained at just over 2 trillion, the same as in capitalist Britain. But what if socialist Britain was less productive than capitalist Britain due to high consumption of the surplus and shorter and fewer working days? Let's assume the absolute worst and say that in socialist Britain there are the same number of workers, 50% of the population, and that everyone works 2.5 days instead of 5 per week, and 4 hours per day instead of 8. Needless to say, this is extremely unlikely given embedded patterns of work and the general human desire for civilization to progress at a decent speed, not to mention the powerful and ubiquitous human desire to work and create. But as I say, let's assume the worst. Since labour times have halved, we can assume that productivity per person would halve. We are now comparing a capitalist Britain with a GDP of 2 trillion and a socialist Britain with a GDP of 1 trillion. Half the people in capitalist Britain, the workers, would earn, as they do now, an average of £14,000 per year. The other half of the population would earn little or nothing, relying on the working population and social services to survive. In socialist Britain, every working person would receive £18,000 per year, out of which the non-working people would indeed need to be cared for. Nevertheless, the average socialist citizen is better off, and this is with the frankly ridiculous assumption that people would work fully half as much under socialism as under capitalism. Now, as you've probably noticed, I'm not being quite fair here, because I haven't taken into account the use of the surplus for reinvestment in socialist Britain. While £18,000 per year would indeed be the nominal amount attached to each worker, since under socialism the entire surplus is at the disposal of the people and not the capitalist class, a good portion of that wealth will need to be held back from consumption and reinvested in order to get production going again. How much of the surplus is reinvested beyond the minimum level required for a steady state economy is up to the socialist citizenry. The wage share in modern-day capitalist Britain is around 50%, meaning that the surplus, which is reinvested to replicate and expand production, is also around 50%. In the mid-1970s, the wage share was nearer 65%. Under socialism, it could be higher or lower, and perhaps we should assume it would be higher, given the socialist priorities of freedom, leisure time and creative fulfillment. So let's say the wage share in socialist Britain was 75%, permitting a slower rate of growth than in capitalist Britain. Growth would be slower, but wages would still settle at around £13,500 per person per year, just slightly less than the capitalist average of £14,000. The impact of equality on standards of material well-being for the majority of people really cannot be overestimated. A smaller pie, more equally shared, will usually result in just as much pie for the average person than a larger pie cut into a few giant chunks and innumerable slivers. So, hopefully I've gone some way towards establishing that an equal distribution of wealth results in competitive standards of living for the majority of people, even when absolute levels of productivity are considerably lower in more egalitarian societies, which is in any case not an empirical trend. Clearly, however, there is a limit to how far this logic can take us. An equitable share of a smaller pie is preferable to a meagre share of a larger pie, only when the difference between the two pies is held beneath a certain threshold. What happens when the larger pie is not twice as large as the smaller one, but 10, 15 or 20 times as large? At a certain point, it ceases to matter how equitable the distribution of the small pie is, since almost any share of the larger pie would be a net gain for the consumer. History is a highly imperfect measure of the potential for absolute productivity among advanced industrial nations under socialism, since mass industrialization has coincided with the rise of capitalism. We do not know precisely how a Western European, North American, Australian or Japanese socialism would look, because it hasn't happened. The socialist economies that have existed have only been socialist in that they have been command economies, not in the sense that the people themselves have controlled the surplus. It is almost certainly true that socialism requires a profoundly advanced industrial infrastructure and productive capacity in order to provide the relative abundance of goods necessary to permit political cohesion long enough for a genuinely democratic economy to emerge and develop. The Soviet Union industrialized as it socialized, but every other socialist economy in the 20th century was implemented in pre-industrial and primarily agricultural environments with poor or non-existing infrastructures and backward communication networks, making planning next to impossible. Insofar as the Soviet Union took advantage of a jump-started industrialization period, it grew as fast as America for more than 20 years before declining for a number of reasons, not least of which were the enormous expense and waste of economic militarization in the Cold War against capitalist America, the economic and political isolation of the Soviet bloc by the powerful anti-communist countries of NATO, natural resource and labor shortages. The Soviets lost nearly 24 million people in World War II, nearly 15% of its population, the difficulties of cold weather agriculture, the gradual marketization of the economy under Gorbachev's perestroika reforms, which were incompatible with the planning system, and, of course, political upheaval as a result of a repressive and undemocratic political system. Needless to say, the differences between the Soviet Union of the 20th century and the Britain, France, or America of the 21st are innumerable. It would be extremely naive to think that socialism would fail in Britain, if it did fail, for the same reasons that it failed in Soviet Russia. Technological progress, material abundance, instantaneous communication, a solid infrastructure, a relatively efficient and experienced state sector, strong democratic traditions, and a widespread loathing of capitalist crisis and inequality seem to me to render modern-day Britain or France many orders of magnitude more likely to make socialism work than the Russia of 1917. I've described the first two of the main forces which I think affect the outcome of socialist versus capitalist productivity, and with the third I hope to offer what I think is the most convincing factor on the pro-socialist side. Equality militates in favour of socialism, lower absolute productivity in favour of capitalism. Even just taking into account these two factors, and using hypotheticals heavily biased towards capitalism, socialism is at least competitive. And when we take into account the astonishing waste of labour under capitalism, I think socialism emerges as a clear winner. By waste I mean the enormous number of occupations and industries existing under capitalism, which contribute absolutely nothing to what actually matters to the question of material well-being, use values. Use values are the lifeblood of wealth, the goods and services that we use in our day-to-day lives. An astonishing number of jobs and an enormous concomitant expenditure of labour in the form of already existing resources are expended for no other reason than to keep capital flowing through the system. Capitalism is alone in requiring a continuous flow of wealth through different hands to sustain its productive endeavours. Money moves from the hands and bank accounts of consumers and investors into the accounts of productive businesses, from whence it flows back into the hands of consumers and investors. Without this flow of capital, production literally ceases to occur in capitalist economies. This regularly happens during crises. This is an absurd state of affairs, which will be done away with under a rational system of democratic planning, in which production is carried out for its own sake, rather than as a catalyst for the circulation of capital. Let's take a rundown of the kinds of jobs and industries which have no other purpose other than to circulate capital, again taking Britain as our example. There's the entire banking and financial sector, accountancy, financial services, insurance, all of which have the movement of capital as their sole function, employing some 2 million people. There's the wholesale and retail industries, which do nothing but facilitate the transfer of money from consumer to producer, producing nothing in themselves while employing another 3 million workers. There's the entire sales and marketing sector, advertising, PR and commercial production, all of which serve merely to conjure up demand that wasn't previously there, and to facilitate the exchange of money for commodities. Another 2.25 million workers, producing nothing which contributes to our material prosperity. There's the real estate sector, again producing nothing and employing 500,000 people to do it. There are the tourism and gambling industries, yet again adding nothing to the store of real wealth, and serving only to move money from pocket to pocket to keep the fragile heart of capitalist production beating. That's another 1.2 million workers. Already we find close to 9 million workers not engaging in productive activity to increase the store of real national wealth. But this is the bare minimum of jobs that would be superfluous to a socialist economy. A significant further drain is the time spent by workers in productive occupations, facilitating the operation of unproductive sectors. Think of the number of construction and manufacturing workers employed in erecting billboards and other gigantic advertisements, producing signs and shop fronts for new department stores. Think of the researchers and designers spending valuable labour hours designing endless new versions of the same products, endless, wasteless variations on the same theme. Think of the time and labour spent on making the exteriors and interiors of corporate buildings, stores and offices aesthetically pleasing to entice custom and investment. Would there be jobs like modelling or prostitution in a socialist society? It seems unlikely. These are jobs which people do because of the hefty price tag on the services of the genetically fortunate, the morally adventurous, and, more often than not, the economically desperate. Such jobs would be very unlikely to exist in an egalitarian society based on the principle of economic security for everyone. It also seems highly unlikely that so many people would be employed in the bar and restaurant industry, since even a semi-rational electorate would no doubt elect to have more hospitals and schools rather than a dozen new pizzerias, McDonald's, and all-you-can-eat Pan-Asian cuisine outlets. All in all, I don't think it unreasonable to claim that somewhere in the region of 12 million of the jobs performed in capitalist Britain are completely superfluous to the production of the goods and services we rely on for our real material well-being. Of course, it would be dishonest to say that what I'm calling superfluous jobs are not entirely necessary under capitalism. Capitalism requires this gargantuan architecture, like the veins and capillaries of the human body, to permit the necessary mobility of money required to maintain this anarchic mode of production. Without bankers, call centre operators, advertising executives, cashiers and real estate agents, there is no capitalism. But a socialist society can focus on the heart of wealth creation, the production of use values. The sectors of the economy which actually produce our standard of living are construction, manufacturing, energy, agriculture, engineering, transportation, research, entertainment, and those useful social services such as health and education, which allow us to expand and enjoy the fruits of our productive labours. There are currently just under 18 million people in Britain working in these productive sectors. A socialist economy would add the labour saved from the dismantling of wasteful sectors to the productive economy. What would a Britain in which 30 million people, not 18, work to produce the goods and services which genuinely improve our lives look like? How many goods and services would we be capable of producing with a 40% boost in those industries which directly produce our material wealth? Even if the outcome of the battle between the material benefits of equality and the productive disadvantages of socialist generosity were to militate in favour of capitalism, and this is far from certain, the factor of capitalist waste tips the balance decidedly in favour of socialism. The assumption of lower absolute productivity under socialism is based on historical contingencies and ignorance of the appalling waste of labour carried out every day under capitalism. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive discussion of the potential, or lack thereof, of socialist societies to provide their citizens with material well-being. Other factors include the issue of incentivization, the direct measurement of demand through democratic control of production, the non-existence of unemployment under socialism, whether the administration of a planned economy is more, less, or as complex as the administration of a market economy, and whether a socialist society can survive the inevitable onslaught of global capitalist hegemony. Hopefully I'll be able to address these issues in further videos, but I hope that the core issues I've explored here make the prospect of a materially prosperous 21st century socialism seem at least a bit more realistic.